Welcome back. On Viewpoint today, we revisit cross-border ties amid efforts by the Yoon administration to ensure a stronger sense of regional security in light of the recent changes to global order. For more, I have Professor CHUNG KU-YOUN from Kangwon National University. Professor Chung, welcome back.
Thank you for having me here.
I also have Doctor Bruce BENNETT at RAND Corporation live on the line. Dr. BENNETT, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Right, Professor Chung, we'll start here. Now, following its largest single test of, I believe, 8 short-range ballistic missiles on the 5th of June, that was just a day after Seoul and Washington ended their joint military drills, North Korea so far appears to have been less belligerent in recent days. I mean, there was the artillery firing last Sunday. How do you explain this seemingly less aggressive stance adopted by North Korea in recent days?
Well, there are many signs actually about North Korea is preparing for the next nuclear test, like they're preparing the wire and the kind of tunnel kind of construction, so forth and so on. But I think North Korea's current behavior is based on their calculations that another test may be kind of make a problem on the relationship between China and North Korea, because additional tests will probably invite more strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula and East Asia from the United States, which will make more competition between U.S. and China more aggressive and more confrontational, which will kind of can be a burden when it comes to two countries' relationship where North Korea rely on their kind of economic assistance, and especially during the coronavirus pandemic period. So that consideration make North Korea more restrained in terms of their nuclear test.
Right. And Dr. BENNETT, do you suppose the heightened joint defense posture between Seoul and Washington, as well as perhaps the trilateral security pledge with neighboring Tokyo, is keeping Pyongyang in check? I mean, simply speaking, how do you explain the current status quo here on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think those are clearly factors. Those clearly make a difference to North Korea. Kim Jong-un does not want to cause a major problem with China, as Professor Chung has just said. He also is concerned that the U.S. could overreact to anything he does, to really step up actions against the North Korean economy, which the U.S. has been a little bit soft on. But also take other military actions that he doesn't want. The recent deployment of F-35 aircraft to the peninsula, it's got to be pretty shocking to Kim. He really doesn't like that kind of system being there.
Right. And Professor Chung, the Unification Ministry here in South Korea recently took issue with North Korea's unauthorized use of South Korean facilities and equipment at the joint industrial complex of Kaesong. Could you tell us a bit more about this issue?
Well, actually, yeah, last week, the Ministry of Unification made a comment about that issue. And I think that shows a Yoon administration's kind of posture toward North Korea. While the currently North Korea policy is being drafted by the Ministry of Unification, but their principle is that they will take a more rule-based approach based on their reciprocity. So when you, in retrospect, in 2020, there was explosion in the North-South Korea liaison office, and current Moon administration didn't take any actions and didn't make a kind of criticism about it. But South Korea's Yoon administration taking a different approach and acquiesce or taking a more softer approach does not really change North Korea's behavior. That kind of mentality in the current Yoon administration's kind of idea.
Right, and staying with the Yoon administration, Professor Chung, what do you believe are the chances of perhaps another joint economic venture between South and North Korea? I mean, President Yoon Suk-yeol has spoken about an audacious economic plan for North Korea if it surrenders its nuclear ambitions.
Yeah, actually, President Yoon made about that plan. As I said, current North Korea policy is being drafted at this moment, but the idea is that if North Korea denuclearizes completely, South Korea will support their economic development. And even if North Korea take a more substantial step toward denuclearization, South Korea will support exemption on the UN sanctions against North Korea. That's the kind of basic idea. But the thing we have to concern is that such economy and security trade model has been applied many times in the past, and it doesn't really change North Korea's behavior in terms of developing nuclear weapons. So that should be taken into account and try to have more creative approach how to engage North Korea to table in the first place.
Right. Dr. Bennett, recent remarks by former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo are making some local headlines here. Now, speaking of video addressing the Asian Leadership Conference, which was here in South Korea last week, Pompeo claimed that Beijing disrupted efforts to denuclearize the Korean peninsula because it benefits from Kim Jong-un's possession of nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's being overly critical of China. China, I think, is interested in taking care of their own interests. From their perspective, they have not recognized that the North Korean nuclear weapons are a threat to China. And so they're not prepared to take a strong action. Moreover, their perception appears to be that the pressure techniques with North Korea are actually wrong and should be backed off from in order to get North Korea to be more responsive to reductions. I think that's probably not right. I think the reality is that pressure on North Korea is an important component, but it's got to be a carrot and stick approach. The United States has got to be prepared to offer things to North Korea to get it to try to be cooperative. Will North Korea ever give up all its nuclear weapons? Probably not. Will it even stop its nuclear weapon production? Quite possibly not. But some reduction in all of that is important. We don't want a future with a huge number of North Korean nuclear weapons.
Right, we don't, of course. Now, beyond the Korean peninsula, North Korea and Ukraine are engaged in a confrontation of their own as Pyongyang officially acknowledges the independence of Moscow-supported separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. Let's now take a moment then to listen in on the comments by people there in Ukraine before we continue our discussion. Do take a listen.
We received a decision today about North Korea recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic. At this stage, we established diplomatic relations. Relevant authorities work in this direction.
Today, representatives of the occupied areas in Donetsk announced that, as they say, they were recognized by the DPRK. Of course, we will react very harshly at all levels.
Right, and right after those comments, Ukraine severed its diplomatic ties with North Korea, to which Pyongyang responded very defiantly, of course. Professor CHUNG, how do you interpret North Korea's latest diplomatic move?
Actually, that was a very interesting move by North Korea. We didn't really expect it that North Korea will recognize those countries' independence. While when you look at China, China does not take that action because China needs to care about their own kind of dissidence and their independence and autonomy of those regions in Xinjiang. So they are kind of relatively reluctant to take that action. But North Korea seems to take up broader pictures that they are tactically aligned with Russia and China, as Yoon administration is kind of strengthening trilateral cooperation with the U.S. and Japan. And actually, Prime Minister Park Jin is taking a kind of talk today in Japan as well. So in response to that strategic coalitions in Northeast Asia, North Korea is taking a more tactical move against this situation.
Right. And Dr. Bennett, staying with the same topic and keeping in mind the earlier remarks by Mr. Pompeo, do you suppose that there was some perhaps external prodding from Moscow or maybe Beijing on Pyongyang for this posture with regard to the crisis in Ukraine? And if so, for what purpose?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have to recognize what this is from North Korea. North Korea is in bad shape economically. They've got major problems where they cannot feed their people. They're not producing goods that their people want. This creates a tremendous degree of instability. I suspect that Russia, with a surplus of oil right now, has probably made commitments to provide more oil to North Korea, even though that's against UN sanctions. I suspect they've also committed to providing food and other goods and services in order to get North Korea to take this action. So this is almost certainly a case of the Russians and the Chinese providing incentives, mainly the Russians. The Chinese, though, certainly want to support the Russians against the rest of the world, which is a bothersome development.
Right. Professor Chung, earlier there had been talk about an impending nuclear test, which is something you mentioned earlier by North Korea. But such speculation in recent days, and do correct me if I'm wrong, appear to be less audible. What are your thoughts on the actual probability of a nuclear test in the very near future?
I think we can make two different arguments at this point, because given that 2.5 years of coronavirus pandemic in North Korea, there is a kind of a shortage of food and kind of lack of medical supplies. People are kind of suffering from that situation. So given that calculations, Kim Jong-un may not be, confidently test another nuclear test in the near future. But at the same time, when you look at strategic kind of calculations, there was a strategic concept announced by NATO, and actually South Korea President Yoon actually participated at NATO summit as well, which actually attempted to check and balance against China. So given the situation, China may not kind of put restraint on North Korea's behavior in terms of nuclear tests. So we can make a both argument at this point, but at the same time, it depends on how North Korea actually feel pressured from China and current situation.
Right, it really does. Dr. Bennett, last week's joint drills by South Korea's Air Force and its US counterpart involved F-35A fighter jets that you mentioned for the first time. Now, pundits say such blatant shows of military strength may serve to perhaps hinder efforts to engage North Korea. Do you agree?
I think that's a naive perspective, because the U.S. has F-16 aircraft in Korea right now, but the F-16s are being replaced by F-35s. So the deployment of U.S. F-35 aircraft to Korea wasn't just about some kind of exercise to intimidate North Korea. It was a test case. It was a case of trying to make sure that we could operate the aircraft in the Korean environment, manage maintenance, and do other things, and certainly work well with the South Korean F-35 aircraft. So this is a development which is coming. Kim may be very unhappy that that is a development which is coming, because the F-35 aircraft is a very capable aircraft and something that's going to bother the North Korean missile defense people, the North Korean defense people in general. But this is something which is coming. And so there's going to be increasing experimentation of US F-35s with South Korean and other South Korean aircraft. It's part of the current efforts.
Right. And that being said, Professor Chung, the Yoon administration here, like you mentioned earlier, is seeking a fresh North Korea policy. Now, that being said, what do you believe needs to be taken into account to allow for perhaps a more productive policy?
Actually, this time is a pretty difficult time for Yoon administration, because currently Biden administration is pretty distracted because of the Ukraine crisis. So North Korea policy is kind of out of their priority at this moment, and their calibrated, practical kind of approach does not include the components of maximum pressure that has been, that might have been invite North Korea to the negotiation table during the Trump administration, but that does not exist at this moment. So South Korea need to be more proactive to the international community that North Korea issue is pretty serious, and we are feeling threatened by this North Korea's provocation at the same time. But as Dr. Bennett has mentioned, there should be a carrot and stick as well. And carrot, as I mentioned earlier, they are not responding to specific carrot we suggested throughout our entire history. So we need to be more creative. But at the same time, we need to make their nuclear development as well as missile technology more costly. In other words, cooperating with the United States in terms of strategic asset, a joint exercise, and developing more missile defense system, that will make costly for North Korea to develop more their technology and venture their provocation. So that should be the kind of part of new North Korea policy of Yoon administration, I guess.
Right, I see. And Dr. Bennett, I understand that it may be too early to evaluate the Yoon administration at this particular point, but out of a score of 10, what would you grant the Yoon administration with regard to its current efforts on North Korea-related matters?
Well, I think you have to remember that at the beginning of the Biden administration, one of the first things they set up was a North Korea policy committee. And it took them over 3 months to reach a conclusion about what the policy should be. I think you've got the same sort of thing going on in the Yoon administration right now. The new personnel are attempting to develop a policy. In the meantime, they're trying to do a little bit of treading water in order to be able to prevent a major crisis from developing, but they haven't really got their full policy yet. So in terms of an interim policy, I think you can score them maybe a 7 or so. But what will be really interesting is what their final policy is that they come up with, which hopefully will occur soon, that they will have their strategy identified. And I say that this should be a carrot and stick approach. There have to be new things offered to North Korea that will catch North Korea's attention. Things to help perhaps with COVID, things to help with their economy, things to help internationally, and not necessarily tied to major reductions in nuclear programs. That's premature. It's got to be a more incremental program. This one step solves everything isn't going to work.
Right, or perhaps a more innovative approach, as Professor Chung has been saying today. All right, Dr. Bennett, as always, thank you very much for your time and for joining us live at this very late hour at your end. And Professor Chung here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for.
Thank you.